On the phone with me right now, James Campion, the author of a brand new book titled Accidentally Like a Martyr, The Tortured Art of Warren Zevon. James, I think this is the second time you've spoken to me.
Yes, thank you very much for having me back, Professor Burns. This was a real thrill for me the first time Backbeat Books booked me on your podcast or show here, and I came away thinking to myself, and I think you said, hey, come back when you asked me what I was working on. I said, this Warren Zevon book. You said, come on back, we'll talk about Warren Zevon. It stuck in the back of my head, and of all the interviews I did, I think this is the one where we really got to the bottom of what I was doing with Shout It Out Loud, and I really look forward to discussing my new book with you.
Well, let's do just that. I got to tell you right up front, when I received the book, I was not a fan of Warren Zevon, but now, James, I'm listening to him on a loop. Why a book on Zevon, of all people?
Well, first of all, that's the best compliment you could give me, and I think you just answered your own question. I wrote the book because I looked around and I started to notice, hey, why aren't there more Warren Zevon fans? I wrote this series of poems, for lack of a better term, which I think I reference in the introduction of my book, called Chaos in Motion in college, these many years ago. And I used to put these one or two liners, like not like haikus, but these little, I try to think of little pithy axioms and such. And one of the things I just wrote there, it always stuck with me, why don't more people should listen to Warren Zevon? And this is back in the early 80s, and then as years went by, Warren, sort of became this cult figure. I saw him play a dozen times just by himself, or with Timothy B. Schmidt from the Eagles, or just with a trio, in clubs and small venues in the early and late 90s and into the early aughts. He passed away in 2003, and his ex-wife, Crystal, who I interviewed for the book, she had an oral biography called I'll Sleep When I'm Dead, The Dirty Life and Times of Warren Zevon. And a good friend of mine, another professor, Professor George Plaskides from Auburn University, wrote a legitimate biography. Not that mine's not, but we'll get into the specifics of mine in a moment. But other than that, there really hasn't been anything on Warren. And I talked to a lot of people. I'm like, yeah, how about this song? I don't know who wrote that. Oh, I'd say Poor, Poor, Pitiful Me, or Werewolves of London. Oh, I know that song, Warren Zevon. So really, the motivation for me was, I love Warren's work, and I find that the 2 or 3 people, or maybe 6 or 7 people over the last 25 years that I've met that really love him, we have this special bond. And I thought, why not share that with more people, and especially musical people such as yourself, who I think really should know about his work. So really the motivation was, why not? There's no other book like it.
And I'm happy you did it, because I really am, this artist that, like most people, I knew Werewolves of London, and I knew Poor, Poor, Pitiful Me, but I knew it through the Linda Ronstadt version. But
right, me too.
Speaking of music, again, I told you I've been listening to him on a loop. I work at a radio station. I can download any music that I want. Of all the songs to title it Accidentally Like a Martyr, don't get me wrong, it's a good song, but it's not one of his stronger ones. What is the title to say to a reader?
Well, another great question. The subtitle is the one that really was a sticking point for Backbeat Books. A couple of them, the people that work there, my editor, Bernadette Malavacca, who's is my second book working with Bernadette. Do you have to use tortured, the tortured art of Warren Zevon? Tortured, it's a little... And I didn't realize it until afterwards that what they were saying is it's sort of this meme, this trope that people use all the time, the tortured artist. But I wasn't saying that. What I was saying is that Warren, in both his life and his work, was very tortured. When he went to write, sometimes he would spend a year painting over a stanza or a chorus. He said he wrestled with putting a bridge in a song until he finally gave up and said, I'm not even going to put a bridge in this song. He would spend weeks over one line, a specific word. He was very literate, very well read. So, he knew a lot about film and culture. So he was always trying to mine those things to put in his songs. So that sort of tortured him. He didn't just wake up one day and go, yeah, I got a melody. I'm just going to write this, throw some words in about love and cars, and we're good to go. That's number one. Number two, the Accidentally Like a Martyr actually depicts, and if you read the book, you probably say, I get it, and maybe you're leading me down that path.
Right.
But he was very much into fate and luck, bad luck and good luck. a certain jacket he would wear, a certain car he would drive, a certain color that he would wear, or a certain color of his hair, a certain soda that he would drink. He was later on obviously diagnosed with OCD, but in the early days it was considered a funny quirk in which he really believed that everything kind of happened to you, completely out of your control. I always was fascinated by the idea of how does one become a martyr accidentally? Oh my God, how did this happen? Oh, Che Guevara or, anyone. And you think, well, obviously that doesn't just happen by accident. It's a series of events that lead to it. But Warren really did believe that things just kind of happened to him, except for apparently songwriting, but which he pained over. So I was always fascinated by that title, Accidentally Like a Martyr, and it kept coming back to me when I was writing the book about how Warren was, he was funny, because Accidentally Like a Martyr is funny. He was also dark. It's kind of dark. And he was also, in many ways, crippled by this idea that things just befall us, no matter our best laid plans, no matter what we do, how smart we are, how well we take care of ourselves, how cool we think we are, the poop is going to hit the fan, and I don't know how I'm going to be able to survive it. So I thought that did speak to the overall series of essays that I included for the book.
Right, and I learned because you wrote the narrative of this book around songs and lyrics. You sort of threw up a stanza, and then from that went the story, which is very clever. And when I read about Poor, Poor, Pitiful Me, like you said, and I am leading you down the path, I went and immediately listened to his version rather than the Linda Ronstadt version. And what I found was, like Steely Dan and some other things, he seemed to love the Charlie Brown character, the lovable loser. Was that him? Is that the reason, or did he just find life in that?
I think it's both. In fact, I know it's both, because I spoke to his family, his son Jordan, who is a huge part of this whole endeavor. He bequeathed me the rights gratis for something like 42 songs, and when the Warren Zevon estate could not provide me that, he showed me the publishing companies that did own it. The co-writers that all work with him, that own parts of the rights. And by the way, they were all fabulous. They all got back to me. They all said, please, go ahead and do it, because they all love Warren. But there's, they all said that Warren looked at life, and I think Jordan says it beautifully, look at that beautiful flower growing out of the cracks in the sidewalk. That he could always find something redeeming in the horrible, horrible parts of life, or just, it's not horrible, the broken parts, hence the cracked sidewalk. And he also saw life as very fragile. And I do believe that the key element, the underlying subtext or themes to a lot of Warren's songs is Charlie Brown trying to kick that ball, and Lucy keeps, lifting it up. And great job by you, Joseph, because I probably should use that as one of the metaphors, because he does talk about it specifically in my essay on Poor, Poor, Pitiful Me. He has a bevy of songs, 2 or 3 per record, over a 10, 11 record career, in which he talks about the femme fatale, the woman that comes into his life and upsets everything, upsets the complete apple cart. What happened? I was perfectly fine sitting here, and then this woman, this gorgeous, dark woman comes in and wrecks the joint. Like Dashiell Hammett or Raymond Chandler, these great writers, these noir writers. Right. I made sure that the book cover was in black and white. All the photos are in black and white. That was Warren. He lived in this black and white drama. So, yeah, I think he did believe in the lovable loser. I think he felt like sometimes things happen to you that's outside of your control, as I said earlier. And I think he also saw the beauty. He gave sympathy to and humanity to a lot of damaged characters, in which a lot of songwriters from his period and his, the L.A. sound, the Jackson Browns, who produced his first couple of records and was close to him, the Don Henleys and the Eagles, Glenn Frey, who sang on these records, Linda Ronstadt, who covered his songs, J.D. Souther, who wrote songs with him, and the list is long, Neil Young and all these guys who were all contemporaries of him. They tended to write about either personal angst, or they wrote about love and peace and expression. And Warren said, how come I have to write about these things? Why can't I do something like Steven Spielberg and make a movie about a shark? Why can't I do like Raymond Chandler and write something about, a detective in L.A.? He wanted to write short stories. He wanted to write like novels. He based a lot of his work on, as I said, Hammett or Chandler or Norman Mailer, great influence on him. So as a writer, you come to Warren and you see that, and I think it's laudable as a writer that he takes these flawed characters, these damaged people, and he gives them that lovable loser. You want to love them and hug them and make it okay when you hear those songs.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned a whole long list of people, and I kept waiting for you to say the name, and I was going to interrupt you and say, tell us about him. It didn't come up, though, but I'll tell you what, when I throw it out, it is pervasive through the book. Tell us about Jackson Browne and his connection with Warren Zevon.
Yeah, well, Jackson loved Warren. He loved him so much that Jackson and I had a little, falling out during the writing of this book because Jackson felt very strongly about the way he saw Warren. And I think he bristles, not just at me, but other writers and analysts and musicologists who like to get inside the songs the way I did and try to paint a portrait of the man. And that's where we differ, and it's fine. I love Jackson, and his work is great. And he did wish me well. But the idea, the connection, if I may, of Jackson Browne and Warren Zevon does run very deep. Mm-hmm. Jackson and Warren both showed up at the same time to audition for a music publishing company in the late 1960s. Jackson being handsome and with a sweet voice and writing these very, very pleasant melodies. Warren Zevon sort of being this stocky, pockmarked, wild-haired, drunken, Russian, Jewish, Eastern European, writing these amazingly classical framed songs with strange chords about headless Thompson gunners and werewolves and, the maniacs who to dig up their ex-girlfriend and make cages with their butt. This is with the amazing dichotomy between their two art forms. But Warren loved the fact that Jackson had a little bit of the dark side, and Jackson loved the fact that Warren saw that light at the end of the tunnel that we talked about. So the two of them connected, stayed in touch, so much so that Jackson kept running around Los Angeles during the early 70s and trying to sell Warren's songs, not only to record companies, but to his friends in the Eagles and Crosby, Stills and Nash and the Byrds. And nobody felt that they can sing these songs because they were so dark and bizarre. What do we do with these things? And by that point, if I may, Warren was already very famous in the music business within the structure of the music business. People didn't know him, but people in L.A. and the music business did. He had a song on the Midnight Cowboy soundtrack. He was the band leader for the Everly Brothers' last couple of tours. He got songs on Turtles records. His song like the Seasons is the B-side of Happy Together, their biggest hit, which kept him going financially in the early 70s when he really couldn't get signed. And when Warren finally gave up, and when he married Crystal and he went off to Stiges, Spain to play Irish folk songs at a bar and then off the coast of Barcelona there by the Mediterranean, he pretty much had given up. And it was Jackson Browne who went into every record company and went to David Geffen and said, listen, this guy is better than all of us. You have to record this guy. These songs have to be heard. So David Geffen finally, relented and said, okay. And Jackson sent him a postcard and said, listen, you got to come back here. You got to come back here. We're going to make a record. And he did. And through all the travails, and believe me, if you read the book, there are plenty of those. Mm-hmm. Jackson stuck by him. Even when Warren jettisoned him and went to other producers, and Jackson was always there. For about 5 or 6 albums, Warren would always say, and thank you to Jackson. This is for Jackson. Always. He never forgot that. And like I said, to this day, if you talk to Jackson Browne, which I did, there is a deep-seated ownership and connection that's almost brotherly between the two of them. And I think that's never really left him. That connection is seminal to Warren's career. And to this day, Jackson still plays Warren's songs at every one of his concerts. When Jackson was touring this summer, I had a lot of fans send me, or text me and email him, doing Lawyers, Guns, and Money or Werewolves of London and that kind of stuff. And it was the band Dawes, Taylor Goldsmith, who I interviewed for the book. they were huge fans of Jackson, and they toured with Jackson, and they came to really love Warren through Jackson, and Taylor has some great things to say about the next generation of songwriters and how much Warren has influenced them. So yeah, I mean that's a long answer, but it can't be long enough to tell you the import and the influence and the kinship that these two great songwriters had.
And I have to tell you, that's all the way through the book. Like I said, it is pervasive. And by the way, you mentioned my favorite song to this point, which is Lawyers, Guns, and Money. I love that song. I do.
What's not to love? What's not to love?
Let me go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
I was going to say, to start this next little section off, I'm afraid I got to tell you, and I'm sure you know this, the restaurant Lee Ho Fook does not exist anymore.
Yeah, it did. It closed.
Yeah, you cannot get a dish of beef chow mein. For those who are not quite knowledgeable about it, Werewolves of London mentions Lee Ho Fook. Now, here's that tortured artist thing. Look, it's music. You got to make money. You have got to, if not have a hit, you have to sell things. And I've heard this story so many times, the hit is the song that the artist dislikes, that the artist said, it'll never work. And the songs that he likes never actually make the hits. I mean, I got that from the book. Am I saying it correctly?
Yeah. No, that happens a lot. I mean, I used Randy Newman's Short People and Werewolves of London that became the biggest hits for both Randy Newman and Warren Zevon, two of my favorite songwriters, two eclectic songwriters, two dark songwriters who take on the untrustworthy narrator form, in which back in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s, when the songwriter period came, people expected the songwriter to bare the soul, to talk about his life, the Jim Croces, the James Taylors, the Jackson Browns, the Neil Youngs, to bring Joni Mitchells, to bring in parts of their lives, to bare their souls. Bob Dylan's, Blood on the Tracks, Joni Mitchell's Blue, Jackson Brown's The Pretender. These are confessional records. Although Warren does have confessionals and you find out his life in his songs, he also inhabits maniacs, murderers, gangsters, rogues, criminals, the demi-monde. He's going inside and he's finding out, like I said, the humanity in all these characters and bringing them into the songs. Werewolves of London is funny, and it's funny on many levels, but the main aspect of it is that what I just said about his torturing himself over lines and chords and for weeks and months and year, that whole song took about 8 minutes to write at best. It was three guys, Leroy Marinell, who passed away during the writing of this book. I miss Leroy very much. Warren and the great Waddy Wachtel, who has been also a great friend of the book. He gave me great interviews. I thought his remembrances really sparked the book, and he's had a lot of nice things to say about it. Those three guys just happened to be in a room grooving, smoking, drinking, and luckily for Warren, Crystal Zevon, who I also interview, who's in the room, ran a tape and took some notes because none of them remembered any of it. They're just yelling out all these lines and now woo, and they just went for it and went on to play something else. And again, if it wasn't for Crystal, the next day she said to Jackson while he was working on the first record, of course, Werewolves of London ends up on Warren's second record, Excitable Boy. She says, "Help! You got to tell Jackson about this new song." What song?
You didn't know about it.
And so the What song becomes Werewolves of London, which becomes his biggest hit. And the one thing, as I said, when I worked on this book for 2.5 years, what are you working on? Warren Zevon. What the hell's that? Werewolves of London? Oh, yeah, that guy. So, it's what he's known for. It's played every Halloween. It's played in movies. Scorsese, his good friend, brought it back for Color and Money in the 80s. So there was a lot of werewolves throughout Warren's career. And to his credit, even though him and Waddy were shocked and dismayed that Elektra Asylum wanted to make it a single, he never bristled at it, ever. He never, ever said, I don't want to play Werewolves of London. He always said, I consider my audience to be the customers, and if a person gets in his car and drives 2 hours or an hour or even 15 minutes or takes a subway ride and waits for an hour as the opening band plays to hear me play, and I don't play Werewolves of London, what right do I have to not do that? I mean, seriously.
I agree with that
should be
so
a note
much.
to everyone, and so he always embraced Werewolves of London, and well, he should, because I know it's a kitschy song and it's a lot of fun, but it's brilliantly done. Half of Fleetwood Mac plays on it. Waddy Wachtel's lead in that song is one of the best leads in a rock and roll song, and you're a guitar player, so you know what I'm talking about. I mean, it's just a great song, so let's give it that.
Yeah. In the book, you quote Warren Zevon by stating that an artist, if he was by himself on a deserted island, he would still write. And if that's not you, you're not an artist. I believe that. Do you?
I do. Hunter Thompson, my favorite writer, did say something that I kind of, and it's easy for me to say because I've been published and I've worked very hard professionally in writing for 30 years now. But I think unless someone buys your work, it's hard to call yourself a working artist. I know a lot of really close friends of mine who are brilliant artists, great musicians, fantastic writers or painters, and their stuff's not hanging in a museum, or no one's buying them on Etsy or whatever is happening. They're not on Amazon or in a bookstore or at a record store. But it doesn't make them any less artists. I think what Warren was saying there, and it's very true, your motivation has to be to create something. Mm-hmm. This constant gnawing to make something, and then eventually that thing will become something. I'm reading Carly Simon's memoir just now, Boys in the Trees, and she talks about James Taylor writing. And she said, I watched James Taylor write songs, great songs that never made it on a record. He worked on it really, and they said, no, it doesn't fit. But he needed to write it. He needed to finish it for himself, for the world, for his kids, for whatever. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the way Warren felt about art and creating. And I think that's true. And at the end of his career, the last 3 or 4 albums in which he recorded entirely at home, because record companies just weren't giving him a budget to go to studios or to hire musicians, he understood, I still want to get this stuff out. How do I do it? How do I create? And he just kept doing it despite all the odds. And I respect him for that.
When you talk in the book, and this is something that people knew about Zevon, there was drugs, there was alcohol, and I'm jumping to another quote here. He says, when a guy gets complicated, he gets unhappy. When he gets unhappy, his luck runs out, which I think is a great quote. But it almost leads to the fact that I get the feeling, and you tell me whether I'm right or wrong, Warren Zevon believed to be the artist, he had to make himself the tortured artist. He needed to be this drug and alcohol riddled person, or the muse was just not going to come. That's at least what I got. Am I anywhere near it?
Sure. You're right on the money. Ross MacDonald, the great writer, who is quoted in Paul Nelson, who's also a great writer, one of the great rock writers, in a wonderful piece that Nelson wrote in 1981-82 for Rolling Stone as a cover, called the Crack Up and Resurrection of Warren Zevon. It was based on Fitzgerald's piece about fame in the 30s. And, excuse me, MacDonald is quoted as saying, Warren would tell him, I don't know if I'm writing these songs because I'm damaged and drunk and wild and tortured, or if I can write songs. Am I just mining these songs as the muse, as you said, from this lifestyle? And of course, Ross MacDonald, being a great artist himself, said, no. You're going overboard. It's not because of these things. You're doing it despite it. And Warren ended up learning that and eventually became sober. But there was a time period there. A couple of things about Warren's alcoholism. The first thing is he first started to drink in the company of Igor Stravinsky, who at that time was in his early 80s, who lived very close to where Warren lived. Warren's middle school music teacher introduced him to Robert Kraft because he felt that Warren could be a prodigy. Kraft had saw what Warren could do on the piano when he was about 11 and 12, and at the time was working with Stravinsky. There was a rumor for years that Stravinsky ended up teaching or working with Warren. That's not true. Warren would go over there in afternoons and drink with Stravinsky and listen to classical music. And Stravinsky would point out to him, and I want to tell you something, Igor Stravinsky, and you know this to be true, with music, Stravinsky is one of those rare artists that come around once every 5-6 generations. Picasso, Beethoven, Hemingway. someone who just changes the complete aspect of what it is to make Godard with film. This is what Stravinsky was. He wasn't just a classical composer. This is a man who was an artist that shocked, dismayed, stuck and twisted and spun the concept of classical music on its head. And he's there at 82 years old drinking with a 12-year-old Warren Zevon. I believe, and this is no way to know this, that Warren equated alcohol with classical music and the beauty of music. And the drinking brought him there. Later on, it became certainly his demon. But I believe it was this duality, this love of music and the drink that motivated. And then, of course, it's the 60s and 70s, so he's into all other things, too. And Warren had that kind of proclivity towards being obsessed with things. So all of that stuff really doesn't make for a safe environment. But it certainly made for some great songs. Yeah.
Right. I've always wanted to go back and ask, the people of the 60s, all we hear today is drugs are bad, drugs are bad, drugs are bad. Would we have had the music of the 60s without the drugs?
Yeah, well, of course not.
Yeah.
No. I mean, I'm not saying Bob Dylan does Blonde on Blonde if he's not on a ton of speed and smoking copious amounts of weed. I'm not saying that the Beatles would have done Sgt. Pepper's or Revolver without dropping acid. I'm not saying that, just name the record or, my good friend Dan Byrne is a wonderful singer-songwriter. Wrote a song about marijuana years ago about, he got busted for like a joint somewhere in Iowa, wherever, and he's writing this song. And in the song, he's talking about, well, okay, then if I'm going to jail, take back this painting and take back Starry, Starry Night and take back, The Sun Also Rises that, Hemingway wrote on, drinking absinthe and all the other stuff. And he's making the joke. I'm not saying that it's like performance-enhancing drugs, but I think in some kind of ways, it was the PED of the music business. But I think that it's a weird... I think all those artists would have been great anyway, but I think it does inform, I think it does shift, and I think it does make the music the way it is. And I put it right in the beginning of the introduction to my book. Warren Zevon was an alcoholic, very bad alcoholic, and it did affect half of his working life and personal life, long past when everybody thought that he was being resurrected. In the early 80s when Nelson wrote that piece, Warren was still much doing cocaine, which, by that point no one thought was harmful, amazingly, and all the other, Quaaludes and pills, and then he went back to drinking again, and then he finally beat it in the late 80s, early 90s, and stayed sober all the way up to the last months of his life. But yes, that's an interesting, and that could be a whole show right there, is what drugs did to the culture, but certainly the music, and it definitely affected, I can name, Pink Floyd, Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, certainly the latter Beatles work. But with Warren, it was deep-seated in the man, and then that kind of thing worked its way into the music. It would have to,
Yeah. You mentioned in the book, or likened in the book, the passing of the torch from Guthrie to Dylan as an equivalent of the passing of the torch from Warren Zevon to Bruce Springsteen. Before your book, I had never heard of Zevon to Springsteen. I had never known they even knew each other. Please relate that to us. How do they go together?
Yeah, well, at that point, I was trying to make the point that Bruce, sort of that torch, that pressure was always on Springsteen. Hammond, brought him into Columbia the way he did with Dylan the generation earlier. There was too much pressure. Warren never had that kind of pressure. He's sort of an outsider guy, and again, he didn't quite fit into the LA scene. Springsteen was an East Coast guy, small town guy that made his way to the big city to write long arias about his generation. Warren's connection to Bruce is weird, like every connection that Warren had. Like the Jackson Browne, it was a happenstance. Warren was touring Excitable Boy, and Springsteen, was a big buzz in the music business. Springsteen caught a show of his in New York, and it was a double bill show. It was a two-set show. So the band played, and they took a break and came. They were supposed to come back 45 minutes later. David Landau and Waddy Wachtel, who were the guitar players for that touring band, both told me Warren never showed up. We didn't know where he was. And this is before, cell phones or anything. So I had no idea where he was. It turns out he was out with the Clancy brothers drinking in the East Village. He finally gets back, and he's hammered, and he gets on stage, and he starts singing. And for some weird reason, and Bruce was never a drinker or anything, he just found it amusingly brilliant. Let's say it that way. And the reason why I know that is David Landau, whose brother John Landau has been and wrote that famous piece at the beginning of Bruce's career, how I've seen the future of rock and roll, and it's Bruce Springsteen became his manager, was there that night as well. Somehow, David, though, ends up in a limo with Warren and Bruce, and they spend the whole night talking until the dawn. And I think David says something to the effect of, I consider myself a pretty smart guy, and I'm a very accomplished musician, but I had zero idea what either one of those guys were talking about. They all of a sudden entered this weird sort of connection, like he had with Jackson, where they just took off. And from that point forward, Bruce was a huge fan of Warren, and like everybody who became more popular than Warren, always had a kinship with him and feeling, this guy needs to be more popular, I wish he was. And Bruce ended up giving a title that Warren loved called Janie Needs a Shooter to him, and the two of them wrote a song called Jeannie Needs a Shooter. And it's one of the great Warren Zevon songs, beautiful string arrangement by Warren. It's on Bad Luck Streak and Dancing School, Warren's third album. And from that point forward, Bruce would always want to know what Warren was doing, and Warren always played Bruce songs like Cadillac Ranch in his sets. And when Warren was dying, Bruce was one of the guys who played on The Wind and sang on it. He was in the middle of a tour. He had a Christmas vacation, and when you do these tours, maybe you get 4 days off, 5 days off, and he spent the entire time with Warren, and that was the last time he saw him alive. But this amazing connection and love that these two great American songwriters have. And in that essay that I write about it, I ended up, I think it was 4, my rides here, that the night after Warren passed, Springsteen opened his set in Canada with My Rides Here, which is just a wonderful song about the afterlife, even though it's joking. This is before Warren thought he was dying. But Warren wrote about death a lot, so that was not surprising. And his version of it just floored everybody who knew him. And Jorge Calderon, one of his longest friends, his tightest friend, and wrote 16 songs with him or something like that and worked on The Wind, said to this day he can't even listen to it. It's just so right on. It's so Warren, and it's like Bruce was channeling him. So when you talk about these connections that Warren had to these other great musicians, they're not just passing. They're not just, hey, I hung out with this guy, or this musician slept with that guy or woman, or they, this guy sang on that guy's record. No. Once someone got in contact with Warren, it was a deep-seated connection. Sometimes it ended badly, but it was not flippant. It wasn't passing. Mm-hmm. It wasn't. It was always deep.
You mentioned it, and we have to go there because it is a big part of the book. And I really enjoyed that when you discussed the death. We weren't at the end of the book. It continued following. But I need to ask you, tell me about the learning of the impending death of one of your heroes. I believe it came through an interview. Am I right?
Yeah. So I had never... One of my, I don't really ever talk about regrets. You live your life, you go, you make your decisions, and you go from there. There's a few things you wish you could do over, or little things that you wish you could have maybe not been so reticent to jump into when a window opens. Never had a chance to meet Warren, despite working and I'm a contributing editor for the Aquarian Weekly and have been since 1997, so Warren was still alive then, certainly, and saw him play, like I said, about a dozen times. But I did go, and I write about it in the book, in the year 2000, just a couple of months, maybe only a month after my father-in-law passed, and I went with my wife, who was becoming a Warren Zevon fan, and we went to go see him play in some club in Rochester, New York, during a snowstorm. And we were right up against the stage that night. But before he went on, we were standing by the bar, and he came over to order, I remember it was a club soda, so he wasn't drinking, and he ordered a club soda, and he was standing, maybe 4 feet from us. And I'm just not that guy, I should have been that guy. I should have said, in hindsight, if you're never going to meet him, ever, or he's going to die at 56 years old, you might want to tap him on the shoulder and say, thanks, man, for all the music, and I'm a big fan. I mean, obviously anyone who's showing up on a Thursday night in Rochester in a snowstorm is a fan of Warren Zevon. He didn't need to hear that. But it would have been something I would have loved to do. So I was that close. Fast forward to 2002, and his record comes out, My Rides Here, his penultimate record, and I get credentials to interview him, and they say, okay, we're going to call you and that's how those things go unless you go to meet the guy in his hotel room or something. They normally call you on the phone, and like you did with me today for the interview, and they say, be here at a certain time, you have 15, 20 minutes, and ask him about the record. So I was all ready. I had all my notes ready to go. About 2 or 3 days before my interview, I got a call from his publicist, which really never happens. They usually call you that day, and that's the end of it. And I could tell by the way she was talking to me that it was very dire. But she just said, due to personal reasons, Warren won't be able to make the interview. We don't have any time to reschedule. We don't know what the reschedule is going to be, so we'll get back to you. But the way she said we'll get back to you is almost, like I said, very foreboding. And it wasn't until about it wasn't long, this was in September of 2002, maybe 48 hours later, I read online in the LA Times that he had inoperable lung cancer. And at that point, and I write about it very extensively in the book, he kind of just shut it down. Didn't do hardly, and I think he did one interview with Time, one interview with Rolling Stone, and he did the Letterman show. But he had just basically shut down all interviews, any media. And his thinking was, hey, where were these people before I was dying? So so that's how close I came to interviewing Warren, and that's how I found out that he was dying. And I tried to use the postscript to the book, all the people I interviewed in the book, and I thanked them all, family, contributors, musicians who played with him on the road, people who took care of him on the road, personal managers, ex-wives, children. They were fabulous, and I want to thank them all publicly once again for contributing to my work. I gave them all each a final statement on what they want you guys to know, the readers, about the Warren they knew, because there were so many different Warrens, so many different. He was one of the more mercurial characters I've ever written about or studied. And I was very proud to get that at the end of the book. So the book doesn't just end with Warren dying after The Wind comes out. He wins 2 Grammys posthumously, but and it was turned out to be his third highest selling record. But these memories, these remembrances, these little snippets into the personal life and what Warren meant to them, I think is a great way to end the book, if that makes sense.
I need you to put a timeline in order for me. I started doing research for this question. You've got Life'll Kill You in 2000, then you've got My Rides Here, then you've got The Wind. Now, I found a couple of websites that stated generally when Warren found out about his inoperable cancer. And it looks like it's after Life'll Kill You and it's after My Rides Here. Do I have that correct? And if so, why is he...
Because you do. Excuse me, because like I said, when I was scheduled to do the interview for My Rides Here, they were scheduling the interview. They had no idea. It was right around the time he was doing press for My Rides Here. He didn't get a chance to tour it. Life'll Kill You is amazing. That's the most prescient album. I think that's his last great work, even though The Wind, I dedicate 9 or 10, it's all escaping me now. I think it's 9 essays to individual songs, and each song depicts a part of Warren's career and life. For instance, Poor Poor Pitiful Me, about his relationships with women, Searching for a Heart, his relationships with friends and family and love. Some songs like The Indifference in Heaven, his inspirations from literary figures. The Wind, My Rides Here, about this prescient idea of death that he was obsessed with, as well as luck, bad and good, throughout his career. But Life'll Kill You is so great because at that time Warren literally was on the skids. There was 4 or 5 times that Warren resurrected his career, and that was one of them. And the songs on that record really speak to an entire generation getting older, the whole baby boomer generation, or the ones shortly after baby boomer, like me, who's not quite X but not quite boomer, and what we went through, and the sadness and the joys and everything that happened in our lives. That's all in Life'll Kill You, in that great sort of dark, tongue-in-cheek fashion that Warren presented. And again, quite prescient. My Life'll Kill You, My Rides Here. And he made a joke about My Rides Here at a show I saw him play in Town Hall in New York City in the early 90s. He was on stage. And the only reason I remember this is because Paul Muldoon, who co-wrote that song with Warren, My Rides Here, the poet laureate from Ireland, he says to me, he says, do you remember that? And I said, I was at that show. He's standing on stage tuning, and a siren goes by on Broadway. And Warren goes, excuse me, my ride's here. And the whole place just started laughing.
Yeah.
So it's a song about shuffling off the mortal coil. Life will kill you. And then, of course, The Wind, a song about dying by a man who's dying. It really is gut-wrenching and fascinating. And I tell you, again, this book was really hard to do for me. First of all, almost everybody around Warren Zevon is eccentric, and I am being kind when I say that. Some of them are just friggin' nuts. Almost all of them refute the other person's what they said, and then so there's that.
Yeah.
And then the second thing is, when I was writing the essay about The Wind, my beloved mother-in-law, Mary Lou Moore, who's a great artist in her own right, contracted cancer that we didn't know about. She felt didn't feel well, but she didn't tell. So basically, by the time we knew about it in May of 2 years ago, and May of 2016, and then it was like 6 weeks after she told us that they died. It was too late, and she died of colon cancer. And I'm writing about The Wind, the same thing. Warren's feeling okay. He's lifting weights. He's looking good. He collapses in a parking lot in Calgary. Says, I don't really feel right. I feel dizzy. So they take him to the oncologist, and the next thing you know, he's got, inoperable lung cancer. And it was just, but Warren lived much longer than my mother-in-law. But you see where I'm going. It's like I'm already in this. I'm dealing with it, and I'm writing about it. Through everything that I did and wrote about Warren, I have to say I came out the other side a changed man. Like my DNA, I make the joke that the DNA changes when you listen to some of these Warren Zevon songs. In that case, as a writer, I came through on the other side, and the experience of writing about this very conflicted man who sometimes, as George Pasquides, who wrote about Warren and would call me every once in a while, do you hate him yet? He would call me up. Where are you at with him? Do you want to, And I never got to that point, but it was a tough road. Bernadette, my editor, said, you did and I'm not giving myself a compliment, but that kept me going. She said, you're doing a magnificent job walking a tightrope with this subject.
No, and
I knew what she meant.
You did. Yeah. You did do a wonderful job in it. I can tell you again at the beginning of the book, or at the beginning of this interview, I told you I didn't know much about Warren Zevon, and I'm listening to him on loop. Look, I've listened to The Wind once, and I don't want to listen to it again. And if you just take the ideas that are in the book, Warren Zevon had to write this magnum opus to his own death and to the frailty of life. That's who and what he was. But to someone who's a fan, and I'm really a come lately fan, it has to be crushing to look at this, but you have to understand why he did it. Right.
Yeah. He did it because, again, that's why I called it the tortured art and not the tortured music or the tortured songs.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was, I've been quoting it all this time. So Oscar Wilde said, I save my art for my life, and my work is what you see and read. But my life is the art. And I think Warren really did embody that in the darkness and the light. But I'd be curious to know, and I think I asked you last time when you and I don't want to ask it too late in the interview because I want to give you time to answer, Joseph, and that is, when you were reading it, my publisher came up with a good idea, and I recommend it to all your listeners. We came up with and you could easily go find everything, but we have a Spotify playlist, accidentally like a Martyr playlist. And in there I put Jordan's version of Studebaker, and if you read the book, you know why. Mm-hmm. And Linda Ronstadt's version of Poor, Poor, Pitiful Me, because that was the first time I heard it. And other covers, including his versions. I have the live Springsteen version of My Rides here, dedicated to Warren after he passed. But I'd be curious to find out, and this is what I was hoping, is that somebody like yourself, someone learned who loves music but was coming to Warren new, did you find yourself stopping reading for a moment if I mentioned a song in the midst of another essay? Because I don't just write about those songs. I write about, like, say, Fistful of Rain, right, which is, or Life Will Kill Ya, or, another song like the French Inhaler, which I give a lot of space to, but I don't dedicate an entire essay to. I was just wondering if you stopped what you were reading for a moment and just played that song and saw if what I was doing inspired you, or if you liked it. I don't know how people are reading this book, because it's hard to ask them. People have been very effusive and nice on Facebook and other places to let me know they enjoyed the book, but I'm dying to know, because that's what I do. when I'm reviewing a book, like I'm all into Carly Simon now. I'm listening to all these old Carly Simon records because I'm reading her book. Did you find yourself listening that way, or you waited for you were done and then you went through his whole canon? I'm just interested to know.
No, I did it exactly as you suggested. It started with Desperados, Under the Eaves, and I didn't know about your playlist, so what I did is I simply pulled it up on YouTube. I read the stanza that you gave, I read a little bit of the chapter, put the book down, listened to the song, oftentimes more than once, and then back to the book. I did exactly what you were talking about. I stopped and listened to what you were discussing.
Is there one song that resonated with you through the prose that when you listened to it, you were like, oh, I don't see it that way that James does? Or on the transverse of that, was there a song in which you listened to and then said, oh, wow, I wasn't really moved by this, but I totally get what James is saying now. You know what I'm trying to say? It's like the translation between the music and the prose is so hard. And I say it in the introduction. Writing about music, it's weird, It's like trying to have a fistful of rain. You could try, and there's some water that gets in there, but you can't hold it. It's very hard to express it. There are some great ones out there. I mentioned Paul Nelson. Grail Marcus is one of my favorites. I love Lester Bang's work on music, but Dave Marsh, I don't want to leave anybody out. But it's such a hard craft. So, was there something that didn't resonate with you? You listened to the song, I don't really like it as much as James, or I like this better, or I like this because of what James wrote. You know what I'm getting? I guess I don't know what I'm asking.
I'll tell you. I know. Oh no, I know exactly what you're asking. When you would pitch songs, I would go in and I would listen to them. I'd go to YouTube and I would listen to them. And when we got to the Springsteen section, I'll tell you, I'm not a fan nor not a fan of Bruce Springsteen, because what it is, it's the same thing, and I understand now why the connection and such, because if I like a Springsteen song, I adore it. Murder Incorporated is unbelievably good. But then I hear another Bruce Springsteen song, and I'm like, this is by the same guy? It's either black or white, and I got that with Warren Zevon. Lawyers, Guns, and Money is fantastic. But I thought Studebaker was at best. And I don't mean to offend you with that. But
that's what I asked.
Right. There were songs I loved and didn't.
He left it off his records. So there you go. Warren didn't think much of it either.
Yeah. It was really black or white with me. It was either Mohammed's Radio. There was this big thing about how J.D. Souther was going on that Mohammed's Radio is the most gorgeous thing in the world. And I listened to it, and my response was, okay, that's okay. It's all right. And I know a Warren Zevon fan right now wants to throw something at me. But it was okay. You know what I mean?
I get it.
Yeah.
No, I do. I feel that way about a lot of artists. I mean, I'm one of those people who do not, and I guess I've never considered myself a music critic. I would rather not write about something. I write about a lot of music, but I write about it, and it could be anything. It could be the Carpenters or the Damned. It doesn't matter what music it is. It could be funk, it could be rap, it could be folk, it could be schmaltzy, whatever you want to call it. But if I like it, I'll write about it. If I don't, I just won't write about it. So I don't spend a lot of energy ripping into something, nor do I spend a lot of energy being disappointed by artists. I think some of the artists that I respect greatly, and you and I spoke maybe the day after David Bowie died, because I re-listened to our interview. You and I spoke the day after that, or 2 days after. Mm-hmm. Bowie, Prince, who passed away a couple of years ago, and I wrote the cover eulogy for the Aquarian on Prince. These are artists that taught you, the Beatles, do not pay attention to this. It's this now. The one thing about Springsteen, interesting enough, is that he does stay pretty true to his art form. It's not the same thing over and over again, like, say, AC/DC, which I love, but I'm saying it is the same thing over and over again.
It is!
It's beautiful, though, but I understand. But they're not doing any, moody blues type thing. But Warren had his moments, too, where he would go off the deep end and do certain things, like Transverse City. But, I find, and this is, esoteric conversation at best, because it's all subjective. Whatever you like, you're going to like, and that's the end of it. But I've never been one of those people who's like, all right, I love Joshua Tree by U2. I didn't like Achtung Baby for about a year afterwards when that came out, which I think is arguably their best record now, because I just didn't like it as much as Joshua. Joshua Tree was so much into my veins. I just could, and I understand when people are like that, but I try to keep that open mind and say, I like this, but I don't like that. I don't have to like it. You know, Tom Waits is another great example. There are some Tom Waits albums that absolutely slay me, and others I just think he's goofing off. But that's just me, and yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I could not agree with you more. Well, look. It's September 7th, 2003. War on Zevon passes. We're now 15 years out. I know a lot of students, and I know a younger generation may hear this. It's got to be more than Werewolves of London on an 80s all-star weekend on W What the Heck. Explain Warren Zevon to the generation that has never heard him.
Well, Taylor Goldsmith said it well. Taylor, I think, is in his early 30s now, so he's not 20-something. He said to me, the great thing about this generation is we're losing touch with irony and sarcasm, satire. We're building safe zones and we're becoming overly politically correct in some ways. And I'm not one of those people who are anti. I don't think you should be able to say anything. And I know that there's been a terrible way of referring to Native Americans and African Americans and women and all the different groups through the years. And I'm not saying that everyone should have a pass on that because, A or B, and I'm not trying to be political here, but I think what Taylor was saying is that Warren has a lot to show us about every side of the human experience. We don't shut it off. I describe him in the book as an unblinking artist. He never blinked first. He'd stare down the subject he wrote about, and he let it come through completely. The Springsteen in the bit, I believe in The Indifference in Heaven, where I bring in The Indifference of Heaven, which is a brilliant song off of his record Mutineer, that I heard for the first time live when he played it a couple of years before he put it on the record, which has so much subtext to it. There's part of the song is written about the L.A. riots, the Rodney King riots. Warren lived down there during it. I mean, his house was almost burned to the ground, his apartment. And he writes in there, they say everything will be fine. I'm paraphrasing. They say the good times are near, or the good times are soon to come, or whatever the heck it is. But the key line there is, but they don't live around here. Bruce and Patty don't. Billy and Christy don't. Christy, the model. And for him to be able to bring Bruce Springsteen in, a man of the people, a guy who spent his life on political causes, who wrote songs, opuses about the working man, whose father was a working man, who came from a working class, who dresses like working class. I'm not saying Bruce is putting that on at all, but Warren actually used him as an example of a vacuous rock star who comes up with axioms and has no idea what's going on in this burning neighborhood right now. Warren went there, and he kept going there. And there was Jackson Browne said he would keep going until this immutable truth came out of the situation. At least his truth, how he saw it. I think a generation of kids coming up now, listening to music, I know their artists do that too. And I'm not saying Warren is just unique in that sense. But I think it's important to listen to him because he didn't walk the line everyone else did. You're inundated with the Eagles. You're inundated with Fleetwood Mac. You're inundated with Crosby, Stills, even to this day. And these songs are 40, 50 years old. But with Warren, he never walked there. He always stayed on the fringe. Yeah. I think it's important that we understand the fringes, especially from artists, because those are the people I want to know about. I want to go to places that I wouldn't visit even. The old saying, it's a nice place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live there.
Right.
Warren wrote about places you don't even want to visit. But I think it's important that you hear them, and he did it in such a gorgeous way. The French Inhaler is a vitriolic, hateful piece about the mother of his firstborn son, Jordan, who I interviewed extensively for the book.
Yeah.
And he said he remembers his mother sitting with a glass of wine and listening to that song once a week, like on a Friday. She put the first Warren Zevon Asylum record on and listened to this song that Warren is just eviscerating her. But she's like, but it's just so gorgeous. It's so heartfelt and beautiful. She ignored everything in it, but she understood the pain they caused each other, but the way Warren couched it. That's a rare, rare thing in life, and I think I don't care what generation you are. Embrace that. I think that's what I would tell another generation.
I'll buy that. The name of the book is Accidentally Like a Martyr, The Tortured Art of Warren Zevon by James Campion. James, it's another home run. It's an excellent, excellent book, and it should be read. Thank you for writing it.
Thank you so much for reading it, for having me on. I hope your students enjoy it. And I think someday, if I ever get out your way, I'd love to come visit and speak about music with the kids and get to see you, meet you finally. But, yeah, this has been a thrill. Both books, working on one now, so hopefully when that's done and out, we can meet up again and chat about it. It's always great talking to you, Professor.
All you have to do is call, and you're in the classroom or you're on the radio, one of the two. James, thank you so much.
You got it, buddy.